Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Frank Festa, and thanks for being with us. Yesterday morning, ahead of their joint appearance at a rally in North Philly at Temple University, Democratic nominee and current Vice President Kamala Harris announced her running mate, Tim Walz, the current governor of Minnesota. It seemed for a while like Harris was going to select either Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, or Mark Kelly, the senator from Arizona. But as the weekend progressed, Walz's name continued to surge in conversations about who could help Democrats build the best ticket, and here we are. Personally, I hadn't really known much about Walz until some of his comments and interviews went viral a few weeks ago, and I'm guessing many of you listening might be in the same boat. So, who is he? And why did Harris end up selecting him as a running mate? I'm joined now by the editor-in-chief of the Minnesota Reformer, Patrick Cooligan, with more on the Democratic ticket. Patrick, thanks for coming on the show.
Good to be here.
So, as a former school teacher myself, I'm really curious about how Walz managed to climb all the way up the ladder to becoming the Democratic VP candidate. Can you help paint a picture of his political rise for us?
Sure. I think that the first thing to know is that he's not kind of your typical teacher. He's one of those, Robin Williams in Dead Poet Society, the very charismatic social studies teacher who really takes an interest in all the students, but you see a lot of people coming forward who are kind of maybe mediocre or less than mediocre students saying that he was an inspirational figure for them. I'll give you an example. He becomes a defensive coordinator on the football team, and they go from being terrible to winning the state title. At the same time, he is the founding teacher of the Gay Straight Alliance, even as he is in the National Guard. And it's in the city of Mankato, which is right now it's about 45,000. And then this thing happens where in the 2004 campaign, he brings some of his students to a Bush rally. I think Bush was in Mankato or in the area. And I think one of them was wearing some John Kerry t-shirt or something, and they were blocked from going inside. And this is a little bit of the Tim Walz origin story. And that's 2004. And then all of a sudden, 2006, people forget that after the 2004 election, everybody kind of thought this was Republicans had this kind of sustainable majority, but he comes out and runs and wins this pretty conservative leaning district in the first district. Then he's in Congress. So that's kind of the first part of his political career. I think it's important that he had this whole life before politics.
No, definitely. And he's been the governor of Minnesota since 2018. What sort of reputation has he built for himself over the last 6 years? What's his record look like?
So he came in, I think he thought that because he represented this conservative district as a Democrat and, he was really strong on ag issues. And at one time he had been endorsed by the National Rifle Association. He'd had a military background. He ran on this theme in 2018 of one Minnesota. And he was going to help overcome all the divisiveness in politics. That's really not proven to be what's happened, at least in part because of, the national political atmosphere. But also, he dealt with a lot of crisis that first term. I mean, all governors had pandemic they were dealing with. And we were a state that took it very seriously. We're a very strong public health state. The Mayo Clinic is here. They're the largest private sector employer in the state. And we had some pretty rigorous regulations around COVID. That was very polarizing, as you can imagine. Then you had the murder of George Floyd. And so you get a lot of anti-police activism and rhetoric, and he's forced to balance the need for justice for George Floyd and putting an end to the police brutality in a place like Minneapolis while trying to protect the city from burning down. And of course, there was rioting and arson, and he's already catching a lot of national scrutiny over his bringing in the National Guard. Was it too late? There's people here think that he improperly militarized the city. So the point is, it was a very difficult governing environment. Despite that, though, he ends up winning and inflation, and there was a spike in crime around the pandemic. He wins re-election fairly easily, and he also ushers in at this narrow governing majority. They took both chambers. He had governed his first term with a divided government, but now it's the Democrats control both chambers, and they came in. Despite a one-seat majority in the Senate, state Senate, they passed a whole bevy of progressive wish list items. It was a really big budget, a robust increase in spending, the universal school meals, they legalized marijuana, and they did a couple gun control bills. They did a carbon-free electricity mandate by 2040. They made changes to protect workers from wage theft, to protect warehouse workers from repetitive stress injuries. He signed a bill protecting abortion rights, codifying abortion rights, even though we already have our own sort of Roe v. Wade style Supreme Court precedent here in Minnesota. It's now in the law. So on and on and on. I think we went into the session thinking with a 1-seat majority in the Senate, there was going to be some Joe Manchin action, and there was going to be a hard time getting much done. And they really just did the whole checklist almost. And I think that's definitely what has endeared him to a lot of the online left, as we've seen in the last 10 days or 2 weeks. If they've kind of gotten into his record, they love what they see.
Yeah, and the final candidates in the Veepstakes wound up being Walz, who is now obviously the VP candidate himself, Shapiro, and Kelly, as I mentioned at the top of our show. But up until last week, as we were talking about a little bit before our call, Patrick, it kind of seemed like it was going to be Shapiro. And, a lot of indicators made it seem that way, not only the polling or, what we were hearing from commentators, but the rally that's taking place tonight. We're recording this on Tuesday. This episode comes out on Wednesday. So last night is scheduled in Philadelphia. So all those signs to me and to a lot of other folks pointed to Shapiro. What do you think changed over these last few days? And why did she wind up going with Walz over some of the other options?
I think she can only answer that, but I was certainly as surprised as everyone, because Pennsylvania is the key state, and Minnesota hasn't gone for a Republican in a presidential race since 1972, and we're not really. I mean, Republicans have treated this like a battleground, but to me, it's really not. And I think what it comes down to is that he doesn't necessarily deliver a key state, but he brings a kind of vibe. I think that Midwestern teacher, football coach who can really communicate ideas in a way that average people understand. And I think they think that, I mean, even if a small portion of the country right now has been exposed to that, they think that with wider exposure, people are really going to find him likable, like they have here, and like people are around the internet and on cable TV have found in the last couple of weeks. And that his personality, his biography, can really sell in those blue wall states. In Pennsylvania, for instance, can he do well in Western Pennsylvania? I mean, can he do well in places that are sort of the old industrial Midwest? They think that he can, and that he can do well in a place like Wisconsin, which is our neighbor, and Michigan. And he also has a lot of institutional support. I mean, people think he's come from nowhere, but the fact is he's chair of the Democratic Governors Association. He really got the strong backing of Shawn Fain, the president of the UAW, and other labor leaders. I think Nancy Pelosi, there was some reporting out of D.C. that she was working behind the scenes. Remember, he was in Congress, he was in the House for a dozen years. A lot of his allies still there. They were calling Harris campaign. And then, of course, he did very well on cable TV for a couple of weeks, went viral even with some of his critiques of Republicans. So it's not out of nowhere. He's been around. And the final piece, I would think, would be, does he just vibe with her personally? I mean, they have some kind of chemistry. Politico reported this morning that was important. They had a good meeting, even though they don't really know each other. I mean, Tim Walz is the kind of guy that, in a room of 100 people, 99 people are going to like him. And he'll spend 15 minutes persuading the final person to come around. He's just kind of a likable guy, if you don't agree with him politically even. So I'm sure that was a big part of it was, can he be a governing partner?
Yeah, well, what I've been seeing online a lot is dad vibes. He's got big dad energy.
Yeah.
It's easy to imagine him. I think I heard him over the weekend talking in an interview about like playing with his dog or doing stuff in the backyard, just like normal guy stuff. And I think his normal guy ism is kind of playing a big factor, like you just spoke to. But in the House, he was kind of known as a bit of a moderate, wasn't he? It's interesting keeping that in mind with how much of a progressive darling he's become over the weekend. So how are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely true on the issue of guns. He was endorsed by the NRA. He grew up around guns. He was a marksman in the National Guard. I went shooting with him myself, actually, in 2017 or 18.
Oh, wow.
The first time I saw him was there's a big event here that the governor often will go to called the Pheasant Opener. It's like the opening of the pheasant hunting season. And I saw him, I mean, he was just completely in his element. I had no idea who he was at the time. To me, he was just some backbench congressman, but you could see the energy. He felt very comfortable. These were his people. So I think that his biography and his persona gave off the vibe of moderate, but the voting record didn't necessarily suggest that. I mean, other than this issue of guns, he did vote for Obamacare. He voted against some of the bank bailouts in the Great Recession, but in retrospect, I don't know why would we consider that necessarily a conservative. I mean, there were a lot of conservatives who were against those bank bailouts, but there were a lot of liberals who were too. I mean, bailing out these formerly rich financial institutions. So in general, his record, I think is liberal, but people have this idea that he was moderate, I think because he represents a conservative leaning district, and also his whole persona and the guns and his support of agriculture. I mean, that doesn't really make you a conservative politically, just because you support agriculture subsidies necessarily. It just puts you in the camp of certain people that we identify with Republicans.
No, that makes perfect sense. What's the word on the ground in Minnesota? The state has already had 2 VPs, Hubert Humphrey and Walter Mondale. How are Minnesotans feeling about potentially adding a third name to that list?
Minnesotans love it when I say we now. I guess I'm a Minnesotan now. I've only been here 10 years, so I'm not really truly a Minnesotan, but Minnesotans love to be noticed by the outside world. And we love when the coastal media takes notice of Minnesota. And so I think there's been, people are proud and basking in this moment. I mean, it's funny because Walz was not the choice of progressives in 2018. They had their own candidate he beat in a primary. She's currently the Senate Majority Leader. And there was a lot of anger at Walz over his response to the George Floyd murder. They didn't like that. They thought he had militarized the city by bringing in the National Guard. They thought his response to another police shooting was overbearing as well. And a lot of them, at first, when they first started talking about Walz as potential VP, some people were irritated that he was getting credit for all this progressive legislation that passed. But people have come around. I think that they're proud of the fact that this is a Minnesotan who potentially is going to be in a Harris-Walz administration. I think it's energized people here for sure.
I believe it. Patrick Cooligan of the Minnesota Reformer, thank you again so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
It's been my pleasure.
Yeah, and for our listeners, don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more on Walz's electoral success as governor, how replacing him as the governor of Minnesota might play out, what this means for the DNC in a couple of weeks, and a campaign finance update for the newly minted Harris-Walz ticket. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. I'm joined now by Ellen Morrissey, BP staff writer and our personal expert on all things related to the presidency. Ellen, thanks for coming back on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. Happy to be back.
Yeah, good to see you. I got a feeling we're going to be talking a lot over the next couple of months.
Oh, yeah.
So people probably are most familiar with Walz, as we talked about a bit earlier in the show. First time as governor. Talk to me a little bit about his electoral performance, both when he was first elected governor in 2018 and when he won re-election in 2022. Did he happen to blow out his competition, or were these pretty tight races?
Walz's gubernatorial margins were pretty wide. He had pretty good performances there. In 2018, he defeated the Republican by 11.5 points. And in 2022, he won by about 7.5 points. So both pretty wide margins, which, Minnesota, it's had a Democratic governor since about 2011. But, it before that had Republican and kind of independent governors. So not a completely through and through blue state here. I think something else to highlight, looking at his previous electoral performances, could also be his performance in U.S. House elections. He is formerly the representative from Minnesota's 1st congressional district. He was first elected in 2006. He defeated a 5 or 6 term incumbent by about 5 points, which is pretty wild, yeah. And then he even held the seat for quite a few cycles. The last time he ran was in 2016, where he defeated the Republican in that race 50.3% to 49.6%, which when you compare to Donald Trump's performance in the district, Donald Trump won that district by 53.3%, and Hillary Clinton, the presidential nominee that year, only received 38.4%. So he put up a pretty impressive performance, I think, compared to another big race happening there.
Yeah, no, it certainly seems like it. And since he's now Harris's running mate, he obviously can't remain the governor, right? Or does it not work like that? I guess I'm asking, is there going to be a general gubernatorial election for Minnesota now? Will power automatically, get passed to his lieutenant governor if he does become the actual vice president, if they win the race? How's that all going to play out?
So he actually can remain governor for now. There are no applicable resign to run laws in Minnesota, meaning that he can hold office while also running for a different office. However, if the Harris-Walz ticket wins in November, then he would have to resign. In Minnesota, the kind of transfer of power there, the line of succession is Walz's lieutenant governor, Peggy Flanagan, would then become the governor. A quick background on her. She first won election to the lieutenant governorship in 2018, and she previously served in the Minnesota House from 2015 to 2019. And if she became governor, she would become the first Native American woman governor in the entire U.S., and she would also be the first woman governor just generally in Minnesota.
So the DNC is now less than 2 weeks away. What happens for the Harris-Walz tickets between now and then in terms of, the formalities of securing the nomination?
The Democratic nomination's pretty much wrapped, which is a crazy thing to say. It's been, just about 2 weeks, and we've gone from no ticket at all to a full ticket on the Democratic side. Harris officially clinched the nomination at the Democratic roll call vote on August 5th. They closed voting at 6 p.m. She emerged with 99% of the delegates voting for her, so a pretty resounding win there. But the Democratic Convention, National Convention, is still happening from August 19th to the 22nd in Chicago, Illinois, where there will be another ceremonial roll call vote where, all the delegates will get to stand, in the stadium and cast their votes. And we'll also be able to see Harris and Walz deliver speeches accepting their party's nomination. I believe, Joe Biden will also be speaking, other, major figures in the Democratic Party. So the ticket is set, but the DNC is still happening.
Before I let you go, Ellen, can you give us a campaign finance update? There's been lots of reporting on Harris's record fundraising tallies in July, but last time we talked, we were discussing a little bit about Harris securing all of the funding and donations that were previously allocated to the Biden-Harris campaign. So has she secured that funding, or is there more to come there?
Yeah, it seems like that transition has been pretty seamless. The Harris campaign was very responsive, and I think within 24 hours of Biden withdrawing and her announcing, they filed the paperwork to kind of change it from being Biden and Harris to just Harris. She's also kind of taken over the campaign infrastructure more broadly of the Biden campaign. So a lot of the, leading campaign staff, campaign managers and stuff, and even down to kind of lower level staff as well. They are also now kind of the Harris campaign. But specifically on the funding, there was some talk about whether or not Harris actually could take over the funds, just because this is a relatively unprecedented situation. And we even did see that the Trump campaign filed an FEC complaint basically saying that Harris shouldn't be allowed to take over the Biden campaign account. But most of the current and former FEC commissioners I've read who have given opinions on this, both Democratic and Republican, have said it's fine for Harris to take over the funds. And even if the FEC does happen to take up that Trump campaign complaint, the FEC, generally speaking, takes a really long time to process and kind of rule on these things. So I highly doubt we would see any resolution of that issue before November 5th.
Makes sense. Ellen, thanks as always. It's crazy to think that this has only been a 2-week whirlwind. It feels like it's been 2 years with all the information packed in these last couple of days. So thank you so much for informing us. We're looking forward to having you back on the show soon.
Sweet. Thank you.
And for our listeners, you can learn more about our presidential election coverage at the link in our show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Frank Festa, and thanks again for listening.